Joe Mullings from 160 Studios in Delray Beach. And today we've got a very, very fascinating, compelling session on board. And by the way, thanks to Scott Pantel and LSI for helping assembling this team of experts in end-stage renal disease. So gentlemen, thanks for joining the call today. And we're around the globe. Would you each introduce yourselves and share with our viewers your title and also where you're located? Tay, you want to lead us in?
Yes, so I'm Dr. Singh. I'm a vascular surgeon, a vascular access surgeon. I'm in Silicon Valley, California, and I'm also the CEO and founder of a medical device company called Assist Devices.
Osman?
Thanks, Joe. Osman Khawar. I'm a nephrologist originally and CEO of Diality, a device company based in Irvine, Southern California.
Nick?
Hi, Joe. I'm Nick Inston. I'm a transplant and vascular access surgeon in Birmingham in the UK.
Alex?
Hi, Joe. Thanks for the invitation, Tej. I'm Alex Mallios. I'm vascular surgeon, director of vascular access at Paris Saint-Joseph Hospital.
Great. And John, you finally made it, my friend, with your technology.
I made it. Yeah, I'm an access surgeon out in South Carolina. You probably don't know where that is. And I have probably the dubious distinction of doing more of this than anybody in the world. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but come to South Carolina, you must come see me.
I'll visit you for the sweet tea, certainly, hopefully. Never a patient, so we'll see what happens.
Absolutely.
We'll see what happens. Well, I purposely wanted to make sure that we had some context around the talent and experience and insight around the end-stage renal disease and what's driving it these days. So let me set that up for our panel. So we're looking at this market is $26 billion, depending on who you listen to today, in 2021. And there are projections anywhere from $32 to $130 billion by 2028. We've watched with COVID and the pandemic, dialysis centers close and facilities don't have the resources to cope with the patient load. And some of that is driving it into the home market. And it's also pushing the edge on technology. Now, technology typically in the dialysis space has been analog in nature. It's now moved to a heavy digital push. And we've seen that with companies like Outset, Diality, and certainly Quanta, to name a few. And then we've also watched CMS with new kidney care payment models. So this is a market that has a lot of dynamics in it, a lot of patients in it, unfortunately. And the economics are setting up right now for both investors as well as clinicians, and of course, who matters the most, the patients, to lead the way on this. So Tay, I'm going to let you bring us in because you've got a very interesting, you and John especially, have a very interesting view on this market.
Yeah, I'm going to actually let my mentor, John Ross, start first, because I think what John will share in terms of the vascular access space, I can then, learning what he has over the years taught me, has led to our device. But John, you want to give us, maybe I'll pass it to John first, and then I'll follow John.
Let's do it.
Yeah, thanks, Tej. Well, I've been doing this stuff for over 40 years, so I've had the opportunity to look at disruptive technologies that go way, way, way back. Everything from how we do access to how we do maintenance procedures to how we do salvage procedures and when we finally abandon. So when we look at disruptive technologies or what's happening now, of course, it's a disruptive place where it's going to go home. Now, the weakness in home dialysis, as it always has been, is going to be the access. We've got to get better access for durability because these patients will suffer from what I call dialysis access frustration syndrome, where they wind up going back to the clinics and not getting the advantages of home dialysis, besides of longevity. They just do better. They just do better. So what we're looking at is how we can do access better to accommodate home dialysis. And that goes from everything from fistulas, where Tej and I have been working on something to maybe preemptively give us better fistulas to start with by dilating veins. We've looked at other technologies, even with grafts, of using self-sealing grafts to go home. Even the dialysis machines, as has been already mentioned. So this push to go home, the rate limiting step of the success of home dialysis is going to be the quality of the access. If we had to put it in a nutshell, that's it. If you look at how fast dialysis is growing, There is nothing that I am aware of remotely comes close to the absolute numbers of folks entering a particular disease process than this, probably because of diabetes and some other things. So what does this mean for us here today? We need to look at devices such that home dialysis, I think, can be facilitated. And what breakthrough devices do we have, as well as maybe doing procedures a little bit different for this? And that's kind of a view from it from 10,000 feet down to 2,000 feet.
Yeah, and Joe, I totally agree with what John did, and I think John leading that segment off is really important. You know, I'm one of those people that's been a researcher, that's been a vascular access surgeon. I have a busy practice, but at the same time, I had an entrepreneurial thought that home dialysis and home hemodialysis is really going to be important going forward. We need better accesses. We need better arm access, better quality fistulas. We need more fistulas, less grafts. We need less catheters. And so being an advocate for patients, being an entrepreneur, and being a vascular access surgeon, I thought that could we develop devices that could be comfortable, easy to be used at home, that could give us some opportunity for better fistulas. And in my arena, and in my experience, and in my research, a good quality vein in a healthy, educated patient who's got the best chance for a fistula is a great opportunity for technical success and long-term success. And so our company really has kind of developed the device that is now been proven to really help, I think, patients get ready for stage 4, stage 5 renal disease and get their veins ready for home hemodialysis after a successful fistula. So well, we've got a lot of experts on the call today that are really going to enlighten us all about that. But that's a great theme for the home hemodialysis entry.
Osman and Nick, I'm curious of what your thoughts about this. So we're talking about a market here of 125 new ESRD patients diagnosed annually in the US alone, 85 million annual dialysis treatments in the US, and 74 billion annual dialysis expenditures in the US alone. And we also know that hospitals lose money on every single dialysis patient that comes into their facility. And also the quality of the care has not been a highest level of satisfaction. So Osman and Nick, thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think from my perspective, there's certainly a transformation going on in the dialysis space in the United States. And a few pieces you touched upon, but just to wrap it up, I think one is that Medicare really is starting to incentivize home dialysis. And this we first saw in 2019 with the Advancing American Kidney Health Initiative, which came out of the Trump administration. And what that kicked off was two models that are really driving towards home dialysis. One is called, it's a bit of an alphabet soup, but CKCC, which starts next year, which is a voluntary model. And this is really the first time that a large swath of the US healthcare industry in the renal space can take risk on the total cost of care, Joe, meaning we care about where this care is happening and how it is happening and how much it costs. And really that, I think, links on to home dialysis, because generally as you take patients home, you start to improve the quality of life of patients. You tend to reduce things like hospitalizations. And a lot of this is then driving other models of care. Innovative new delivery models are coming out, things like transitional care units, new companies that are moving towards population health and CKD and ESRD, and the decentralization of dialysis that's sort of been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, but also telehealth as we move generally into this space and try and get dialysis out of the institutions of dialysis centers around the country and into patients' homes. And as the two vascular surgeons have mentioned, I think access is an important piece of it, but I think there are other pieces on the technology side that are important too.
Nick, your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I echo Osman's thoughts there. And I think, we've got to question why we perform dialysis 4 hours, 3 times a week in a facility. And that's evolved to fit around the facility, not to fit around the patient. And home hemodialysis gives patients much better options for spreading the dialysis sessions out. It's a better quality of care for patients. It's actually a better model for longer term healthcare, but access is really important in that. Needling a graft 5 times a week is not a great idea, whereas a fistula will tolerate that. So we've got to really turn this paradigm on its head, that home hemodialysis is not just an alternative to hospital and unit hemodialysis. It's an advantage to the patient. And also we have to adapt what we're doing to fit around that facility.
Alex, question for you. So dialysis is one of the largest and most expensive, yet least change sectors of the healthcare market. And we've watched technology been siloed there, and multiple devices, different training, and different care continuums. Why is that so, and what needs to change, and how will it change? And what are the hints in the market today that is going to change?
Well, I think what happened with dialysis, Joe, thanks for this question, is that for so many years, decades, it was not a very interesting subject for physicians or even the market and the companies. And with the numbers of patients increasing, this became more important for governments, but also became more important for the industry. So all of a sudden, we have more interest, we have more technology being developed, we have two new techniques for percutaneous fistula creation, which is something very recent. We have drug-coated balloons that are also initiated in this arena, trying to make things better for these patients. And of course, we have other technology being developed, like grafts, like John mentioned, or the device that Tej is developing to try to improve vein quality in order to have better accesses. So I think with all this development and all this money that flows in and research that is being pushed thanks to this new budget that is now becoming available for the treatment of these patients, we're going to have more and more evolution of this domain.
So we're talking about the opportunities here, which is always interesting, and the drivers, but what are the headwinds right now? Is it the clinician? Is it the referring continuum? Is it the reimbursement? Is it the lack of technology that's gotten the attention for people's organizations like Tay and others to aggregate easier access? So Tay, your take on that as an entrepreneur and also an MD.
Yeah, so I think that's really a great question, Joe. And I think that, we face this innovation of new technology and then the cost related to those. And I think the answer to that is two. I think for many years as a vascular surgeon, the education of patients has really lacked as they've entered stage 3, stage 4, and eventually stage 5. I think the patients are lost between primary care sometimes. If they've got a great nephrologist, there'll be some ongoing education. And of course, speaking as an American, in our country, we have regions where the people are getting great nephrology care, and there may be underserved areas where the care isn't that good. I think the education of the patient has to start at an earlier phase. And I'm really happy that I think social media, if you look at what's happening in social media, a lot of renal failure patients are rallying on social media to learn about renal failure, renal disease, diet. I think the next level that is really the headwind is the cost. The cost of dialysis, who's going to bear that cost? In America, most patients after a few months will eventually get Medicare. I think Medicare will provide some of those resources, but if there's technologies that are coming along that are very expensive, patients may have fears of setting up home hemodialysis systems in their homes, fear of sticking their fistulas with needles at home, having the support structure at home. I think it's a balance of innovation, cost, and the lack of education globally on renal disease. And I think that's the opportunity that will change going forward. And I think we're entering those realms now where patients are really getting educated about the opportunities that take care of themselves. And the home environment might be one of the best places for that. It's less daunting there.
Speaking about what Tej said there, I think one of the pieces on the reimbursement side, Joe, is that right now, reimbursement from Medicare is 3 times a week. And it's been really challenging in the United States to get reimbursement for any dialysis that's more frequent. Traditionally, home hemodialysis has been 5 times a week because the technology just hasn't had the power to do this 3 times a week. And so that reimbursement deficit is really a challenge. It's one of the reasons Next Stage had trouble getting their home dialysis therapy to really bloom, is because they had reimbursement challenges in trying to get it done 5 times a week. So I think part of it is trying to not make home hemodialysis different, just trying to extend upon the dialysis, all nephrologists and other ancillary services know how to provide this. And part of that is getting a machine that's able to provide this 3 times a week into the market.
Hasn't Outset just got some approval from CMS in regards to their platform that may change the pathway forward? Osman, you might have some insight into that.
Yeah, there's 2 pieces there. One is the approval from the agency to provide it at home, and they got that a few years ago. The second, which is really exciting, is new legislation called TPINES, which allows increased reimbursements for innovative devices in the dialysis space for 2 years. And that's what they just got. So it's an add-on reimbursement for a device that is new to the market. So they'll get that for 2 years, and other devices that follow will also be able to do the same.
John, I'm curious from you. You mentioned you've been in this for almost 4 decades, and you've seen trends and influences and wins and losses in this massive market. What are you most concerned with from the other side of the fence with home dialysis and the centers of care shifting there from potentially classic dialysis centers or even hospitals?
I think my biggest concern is the quality of the access, because think about dialysis access. There is no algorithm. There's no universal algorithm that has been established. In other words, you could go from Portland to maybe San Diego, up in Maine, Miami, and look at hip operations, aortic valve operations, anything. It's the same operation, but not dialysis access. Why is there such a huge center effect on the quality of dialysis? My biggest concern about home dialysis is going to be the access, because none of this other stuff means much unless we've got a quality access that, as has been mentioned, Nick mentioned this, we've got to have an access that's going to be stuck 5, maybe even 6 times a week. So you're almost doubling the number of traumas to that access. So it's got to be incredibly durable. So what's my concern? It's the quality of the access and trying to establish an algorithm such that many of the surgeons on the creation mode, or if it's percutaneous fistula, really getting the best access to give us that durability. That's my biggest concern.
Other clinicians in this session here, what are your concerns with, especially as we move to the changing centers of care and we move this into the household? Nick or Alex?
Sure, I think patient education is really important, and patient education that they can self-cannulate or a carer can cannulate. And I don't know how the setup is internationally from that. We do have some challenges with that. I think a good working fistula is probably easier to cannulate than a graft, and I'm happy to listen to other people's comments on that. But I certainly think that patients need to be educated that home hemodialysis may be a better option for them than in-center hemodialysis. And actually, if we can shift across to that, that'd be ideal for a population base to free up other beds in dialysis centers where there's limitations. I think one thing we haven't touched on here is we're kind of talking about United States here in North America, but Alex may be able to comment on this as well, having worked in low middle income countries. Dialysis is very much an evolving modality in lower and low middle income countries, and I think the market for this and the ability to be able to provide dialysis and good access is really important to look at. Not just developed countries, but elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree, totally agree, Nick. And, I think the dialysis seems as if many times is a disease of the poor. And it is very likely the case because it's often complications of not treated or badly treated diabetes and hypertension. So you will see that poorest countries or poorest parts of the population with less good education will get this problem. So how are you going to have these people well educated in order to be able to care of their fistula and reliably cannulate this access? For sure, the numbers are big, and this is a big challenge. And you definitely want to have a good fistula. And when we say good fistula or good access, this means sufficient length, superficial, low pressure, so you can avoid issues. And it is a big challenge to say that you're going to have this type of access for the majority of patients.
It's an interesting comment there because oftentimes investors as well as the community at large tend to view the perfect scenario. And Nick, you and Alex, you bring up an interesting point. It tends to be a disease of those who are sort of at a lower economic strata than most. And so you're talking about access, you're talking about facility, you're talking about educational platforms, and then how many clinicians can reach that population at scale and continue to augment and support the ongoing education, because it's not a Friday night session. Come on in, we'll show you how to do this, and we'll get a home dialysis machine to your facility. So this is a massive move in itself. Is anybody addressing this right now at scale?
I think part of this, Joe, is really, it's the two big pieces really are the technology needs to be easier to use. And really to get this to more people, it needs to be much more of a consumer-centric device. If we look at the dialysis machines of old, they're big, they're cumbersome, they're really challenging to use. And so you limit already the number of people that need to utilize it when it takes weeks to learn it. And so moving to a more consumer-centric device that is still able to perform powerfully dialysis at home, but is simpler and easier to use, I think is very important. If you combine that with effective access, I think you've got a winning proposition, and you really widen the number of people that can utilize this, not only locally but around the world.
So we were earlier chatting about access and the aggregate products that will probably make this more likely successful at home. And John, Nick, Alex, and Tay, so can you describe the difference between surgical and endo AVF options for patients and MDs to understand? I don't know who wants to start with that. Tay, you want to start with that?
Yeah, so historically, and it's a great question because we've got world experts on this panel today that really I look to as really the leaders in this. But historically, you know, you look at a patient will be from primary care will go to a nephrologist, and a nephrologist historically has partners in surgical fields where a vascular access most of the time surgically is created. And if the patient has good anatomy, we like a fistula, which is basically the patient's artery and vein, and we like that to be either connected at the wrist or at the upper arm. And some of that is based on patient selection, some of that is based on surgical preference. But historically in America, from general surgeons, transplant surgeons, and vascular surgeons, vascular access training may not have always been to the highest level in the fellowship training programs. America only graduates 120 vascular surgeons right now, and there's a demand to do so many other things in vascular space that vascular access training and vascular access skill sets may not be ideal. But that's the historical model of a nephrologist sending a patient to a surgeon. And that still is happening all over the country and all over the world. If you look at what new technologies, and we have Nick and Alex here, and I'm sure John will share his 10,000 feet altitude presentation on this, but there are new technologies which are endo-AV fistulas, which will enable maybe interventional radiologists, maybe interventional nephrologists, vascular surgeons, other types of surgeons to learn these skills, use good patient selection, and now do a different type of fistula. So we've gone from wrist fistulas, maybe now to endovascular elbow fistulas, to upper arm fistulas. And at the end of the day, if we can't get a fistula, then we can sew in a graft. And if none of those work, we can look at transplant, we can look at peritoneal dialysis, or we can look at just having a catheter in the neck. And the new guidelines are all about really what's doing the right access for the right patient at the right time. I will say this, that the most important thing, once again, going back to knowledge and education, is really to have a surgeon or an interventionalist who understands the anatomy, knows what the best opportunity for the best successful fistula is, a fistula that hopefully won't need a lot of intervention. And going into that, really a good quality artery and a good quality vein sets that patient up. So I think that's sort of the discussion that needs to happen as regarding vascular access, but I'm sure our other panelists will really give their experience.
Yeah, Tej, I agree with that. But again, I go back to there's no unified algorithm on which access to do. I think this is the big thing. When we do an access, we plan 3 accesses ahead. You don't just do the one in time t equals 0. What are we going to do in a year? What are we going to do in 2 years? And then that gives you an access program that's going to last for the life expectancy of the patient. So consequently, when we look at percutaneous fistulas, and Alex needs to comment on this because he's the best, but when I look at percutaneous fistula, where it fits in the algorithm, it does not prevent me from doing all the other surgical fistulas that I may need to do 2 years, 3 years down the road. And I think that's very, very important, that even the percutaneous fistula, assuming that we can get to that maybe in stage 4, and it will give us veins, 3 different big veins up the arm that will allow us, if need be, to convert them to surgical fistulas later on. Now we're developing an algorithm. We're developing a fistula algorithm, and it's much better than what we tried to do in the States here with the fistula first. Don't you think, Tej?
I totally agree with you. Absolutely.
So let me comment here, and thanks, John, for the kind words. Let me analyze a bit what's happening with fistulas about pressures. So as John mentioned, we are thinking ahead of time, and the paradigm so far has been start distally in order to save the veins more proximal and be able to create fistulas in the future. So when you create a surgical fistula as a surgeon, you're trying to create a fistula that's going to have enough flow in order to mature and in order to provide dialysis, but not too much flow in order to avoid problems of high pressure or problems of steel, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what makes this surgery very challenging, because you're trying to balance things between the two, and you may have anatomy problems, and you may have patient-related problems, or you may have physiology problems, and you name it. So that's why it's also so difficult to tailor it and kind of make it more universal, as John mentioned. So when you create a surgical fistula, what you're doing is that you're taking one single vein and you're putting it on the artery, and all this pressure goes from the artery to the vein, and it's creating a high pressure vein, which is going to mature rapidly, and it's going to be easier to cannulate. But in the same time, this is what creates many problems that are very also relevant and perhaps restrictive factors for home dialysis. So a very aneurysmal fistula, high tension fistula, skin necrosis, bleeding after puncture, you name it. So I think what happened with endo-AVF, and that was not the intention of the industry. The intention of the industry, or the inventors, if you wish, was to create percutaneously and minimally invasive the same thing that we were creating surgically. And unintentionally, what they did was to create hemodynamically something that is more similar to the distal fistula, but with a better inflow. And I explain. All endo-AVF, both systems, essentially create a multiple venous outflow fistula. And thanks to that, you have lower pressures. So this is what we see with endo-AVF, is that in the long term, they seem to behave kind of like the distal fistula in the way that the inflow does not become too much, too important, and the pressures are not so important. This is why you have less aneurysm creation, less issues with bleeding after puncture. And I think this is what makes it promising. And I think it became clear that this is the case, although that was not the intention initially, that this might be finally an advantage that we need to take into consideration.
On the point of access, Alex, and thank you for that. So, Tay, I want to jump into this while we're on the subject, this wearable compression technology, and the genesis of it, and how that plays into this conversation we're having right now.
Yeah, so Joe, obviously we've talked a little bit about this whole space of access. And, I think when you think of ways, when we think of wearable technology, we're thinking about ways to do something in a simple, non-significant risk way. Everybody knows that a good artery and a good vein will lead to hopefully a successful surgical fistula or an endovascular AV fistula. You need an artery, you need a good vein. And so for many years, patients have been told to exercise their arms, do squeezy balls. They're doing trials in Holland with what they call the pinch trial, basically doing a supervised exercise program. And basically what we're trying to do is increase with these exercise programs or with compression bands, we're trying to increase artery flow with exercise, and we're trying to obstruct vein flow with bands, and there's new technology which I also share, but basically trying to enlarge your vein and at the same time increase your artery flow. If you have a large vein and you have an increased artery flow, your chances of a surgical fistula, which tends to be what we prefer, and as we go into the home hemodialysis space, is probably going to be preferable to grafts. And so basically our device took the science that was happening in our laboratories at the University of Chicago and at Stanford and in Japan, and showed that intermittent compression can help enlarge veins. And we've just now published the FACT trial, which was a 50-patient global trial that's coming out in the Journal of Vascular Access, basically showing that if you wear a device like this, you will enlarge your veins. You'll enlarge your veins at your wrist, you'll enlarge your veins in your upper arm, basically using intermittent focal compression. People do that with exercise, with isometric exercises. People are always looking for ways to enlarge their veins. Blood flow restriction bands, weightlifters use that to increase their veins. So what we wanted to really do with pneumatic compression would give a safe intermittent compression device, a home wearable, a device patients can use at home to help condition their veins for eventual placement of any type of fistula. So that's the science behind it. We are excited about our trial results. We're excited about what the future holds. We think this will be a great part of education for these patients. I think stage 3, stage 4 patients should be starting to be primed, as Dr. Ross has alluded to. You need to think about access today. You need to think about access a year to 2 years from today. And so I think getting ready a patient for education about vascular access, getting them educated about vein care, getting them ready for surgery or endoAV fistula, and getting them ready for home hemodialysis goes back to the point that I alluded to at the start. Education is going to be a big player in this. And I think that the pneumatic wearable space is an accepted space, and it could be hopefully a very good part of the education paradigm, in addition to giving much better results for fistulas.
And this compression technology works just as well whether we're surgical AVF or endo AVF?
Yeah, so that was great, and that's what the FACT trial, there were 2 trials that came out, and the one has already been published, and the second is being published in 48 hours, we've been told. The FACT trial was basically showing the forearm veins dilated up to about 0.6 millimeters and up to about a centimeter in the upper arm. And the perforator vein, which is crucial for endovascular success, dilated 0.6 millimeters also. So now you have a device which is altering the science of wall shear stress, wall tensile stress, and I think both of those release nitric oxide, that wearing a device simply below your shoulder can alter your vein sizes, which give all interventionalists or access surgeons the opportunity for a larger vein.
Kev, I have one other sort of cohort we've not chatted about here. We've certainly spent time with clinicians. We talked about the patients. We even talked about a little bit about the economics, but let's also chat about, oftentimes we don't spend enough time, the healthcare providers themselves, the nurses and the specialists who are in there. And as I did some investigation into the home healthcare and the switching centers of care, we talked about a very high level of staff burnout. And that was occurring even before the pandemic, and certainly the pandemic aggravated that. We've got a cost that's 15% less than in-center dialysis. We've got facilities issues with the dialysis centers. And then the hospitals losing dollars while outcomes remain poor. So what happens to that set of employees in these dialysis centers as we move these changing centers of care away from dialysis centers, away from hospitals, and then into the households? Anybody want to think about that? John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that after being around the industry for so long.
That's the problem, and I think you said it very well. We do so many different clinics, and what we had noticed at those clinics that had stable personnel, the accesses got treated much, much better than the 30 to 40 to 50% 2-year rotation of personnel. So what will happen, this whole thing is about cost, of course, to some degree. I think patient care is huge, but let's face it, as you said so well, cost is built into this. And what will happen I think that 15% or so that you talked about, they will just have to find some other way and they will have no trouble finding some other kind of work to do in the medical industry. But this is the big thing with Fresenius and DeVito, of course, is that they're trying to get their overhead down, but they will still have the economy of home dialysis to still be able to make money. The hospitals themselves, where there was actually a very large study done, when you have the appropriate access done to patients, you decrease the number of hospitalizations tremendously. It's directly related to the quality of the access, that you just don't have the complications. So where are we going with this? Is that hospitals win, the clinics seem to win, the nephrologists are happy with this, and the patients are extraordinarily happy to have this done. We have a very robust system in South Carolina where the education program for the patients is absolutely superb. And we are watching a rapid growth in home dialysis. And it was thought for a period of time, of course, once you became a dialysis patient, your IQ dropped 25 points, that you couldn't do things. Well, some of these patients that really are not, they don't read very well, but they can understand how to use these machines and they get very, very good at it. I keep going back to the same thing, guys. We've got to get that really good access and this whole thing will work. If we don't, it's going to be very challenging to get it to work on the scale that we want to get it to work on.
Thank you, John. Gentlemen, okay, as we finish up here, final thoughts. Alex, your final thoughts on what we chatted about today and where the market's going and what should we be sensitive to?
I think being the leaders on this field, let's just don't forget how important is also prevention. We're talking about access, but let's just not forget that governments and research needs also to be targeted to prevention of diabetes, hypertension, and the complications of this disease that is dialysis. I will agree that any technology that can provide better veins is very, very welcome, and it will definitely improve the results of access and eventually home dialysis or central dialysis. So I congratulate Tej and the work that he's doing on this domain.
Nick, your comments on closing out, thoughts and other areas we should have touched on.
Some great points there, and I think I'd like to reiterate some of those points about a fistula is only as good as it being used and being cannulated successfully by the person who's cannulating it. And that's where this, having great access is needed for home hemodialysis. I think home hemodialysis really is something we should be pushing for. We have quite a lot in the UK and patients really benefit from that and can maintain quality of life, employment, and reduce hospital stays. And back to the things that Tej was saying, I think getting in there early and actually engaging the patient, not just educating the patient, but the patient becomes responsible for their own care, I think is a really important point. And that starts with things like fist assist, vein preparation, education, and also the education about how a machine works at home and making it simple at home. And I think that's where Osman comes in terms of more easy to use. We always thought dialysis machines were heading in the direction of kind of more sophisticated Mercedes rather than a more usable Land Rover. And I think, people want a Jeep. They don't want that works for them and is reliable. They don't want something that's fancy and got leather seats. And I think that's where I hand over to Osman in terms of where home hemodialysis utility comes in.
And Osman, that's a quick handoff to you. Your thoughts.
Yeah.
And you're in a really interesting perspective. Your closing thoughts.
I think lots of good conversation here. I do think that to fix this, and to me the solution, Joe, is not necessarily home hemo, but more dialysis being done outside of the traditional in-center space. So that could be self-care, assisted dialysis, home hemo, PD. There's lots of ways it should go, but I think more patients coming out of the center. What I find exciting is that the renal care in the United States moving out of a volume-based system and to a value-based system. And I think the patient being central to that means that this is a win-win for everyone. And I think as long as we stay on that path, and kudos to all the payers pushing us in this direction. A shame it took so long, but it's a great direction moving. And I think the winners in all of this really ultimately will be the patient. So that's fantastic.
Agreed. Tej?
Yeah, no, this has been, Joe, it's been a great session. And I think that you've got the expertise here that I have learned a lot. But I think that at the end of the day, we all take care of patients. And I'm excited for nephrology. I'm excited for vascular care because I think with better nephrology opportunities for dialysis, more education happening to the surgical community, the interventional community, the focus on nephrology care, the growing needs that this patient base is going to happen. I live in a healthy part of America in Silicon Valley. The amount of patients that I'm seeing that are in their 80s and 90s now with late renal failure, and they have supportive family structures at home. And you can just see that now that they're 85, 86, the years of high blood pressure, diabetes, other medical conditions have led to renal failure. So I think having systems in place, and what's exciting about dialysis is the teamwork that's involved. You've got the patient, you've got the family, you've got the nephrologist, you've got your surgeon, you've got your technicians, you've got your innovations, you've got your entrepreneurs, and you've got a model of value-based care all happening in front. I don't know of any, and then of course you've alluded to it already. You got the nurses, the technicians, the home therapy. This is a big beast of an opportunity. And I think having the expert providers, having the education, and having entrepreneurial techniques and new ways to do things is only going to help everybody globally. And I think what's being shared in America today can be applied to India, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Asia. I think all of this is going to help the patient. So this has been a fabulous session as we prime the pump literally for where I think nephrology will be and vascular access and dialysis will be going in the near future. And it'll be coming up very soon on us. So I agree, and I thank everybody for their education and time today.
John Ross, you want to take us out with your expert POV, point of view?
I think the point of view is simply going to be straightforward. We know exactly what needs to be done. And I think Tej said it well. We have so many different players in here. This is such a magnificent opportunity. But a lot of people can have great ideas. It's always the implementation of the idea. It's always the implementation. So we've got multiple players that we're going to have to get it implemented. Everything from starting backwards with the patient to the machine and all the way back again to the access. And all these things have to line up very, very well. If we can line this thing up and jumpstart this over the next, I'm just making up numbers, 2 years, it will all of a sudden go on autopilot, where now the standard of care has changed and the whole conversation is aligned toward home dialysis rather than being an outlier. It is the inlier.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a fantastic session. We were approaching this subject from many different purviews. We all know that rewards drive behavior. And so with that, all the supporting teams around this are driving towards both better health to the patient, better access, and better outcomes. So I do appreciate everybody's time on this and a very important subject. Much thanks to our panel again, and especially our host, Scott Pantel and LSI. Keep in mind, LSI has got our conference coming up for 2022 at Dana Point in California. The Emerging MedTech Summit, Monarch Beach Resort, the Waldorf Astoria. Partner on the Pacific with the leaders building MedTech. Don't miss it. It's one of the best of the year. I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.